Have you ever felt like someone is emotionally close to you one day and completely distant the next without any clear reason? That strange shift can leave you confused, overthinking, and even blaming yourself. You replay conversations in your mind. You wonder what changed. You try harder, you adjust yourself, you become more patient, more understanding, but somehow the distance only grows. And the most painful part is this: nothing obvious was ever said, no clear ending, no direct rejection, just silence, excuses, and emotional inconsistency that slowly drains your peace. This is where most people get trapped without even realizing it, because the human mind is wired to seek clarity. When we don't get clear answers, we create our own. We assume, we explain, we justify. And when someone gives mixed signals, the brain doesn't register it as rejection at first. It registers it as a problem to solve. So you try to fix yourself, thinking maybe you are too much, maybe you are not enough, maybe if you communicate better, they will come closer again. But what if the truth is not about your worth at all? What if the pattern you are facing is something deeper in their emotional wiring? There is a type of emotional pattern in people that psychology often describes as avoidant behavior. But not all avoidance is loud or obvious. Some people don't push you away aggressively. They don't block you. They don't argue. They don't create dramatic endings. Instead, they slowly step back while still staying present enough to keep you emotionally attached. They respond, but not deeply. They talk, but not consistently. They stay in your life, but never fully enter it. And this creates something very powerful psychologically: uncertainty. Uncertainty is one of the strongest emotional triggers in the human brain. When things are unclear, the mind becomes addicted to answers. You think about them more, not less. You check your phone more, not less. You become emotionally invested not because of connection, but because of inconsistency. And this is where covert avoidant behavior becomes so difficult to recognize. Because on the surface, everything looks fine. There are messages, there are replies, there are moments of warmth, but underneath it, there is a pattern of emotional withdrawal that keeps repeating itself. And here is where it becomes even more important to understand. People who are emotionally avoidant in a subtle or covert way often use simple, everyday phrases that sound completely normal. In fact, they sound responsible, calm, even mature. But emotionally, these phrases can signal something very different. They can be ways of maintaining distance without creating conflict, ways of protecting themselves without explaining their inner discomfort, and ways of keeping you close enough to not lose you, but far enough to not feel overwhelmed. This is why so many people get stuck in confusing emotional loops, because nothing looks wrong enough to walk away, but nothing feels right enough to feel secure. You are left in between, and living in that emotional in-between space slowly affects your self-worth, your confidence, and even your ability to trust your own judgment. But understanding this changes everything, because once you start recognizing these subtle emotional patterns, you stop personalizing them. You stop assuming you are the problem every time someone pulls away. You start seeing behavior for what it is, not what you hope it could be. And that awareness alone can save you months, sometimes years, of emotional confusion. And that is exactly why this video is important, because what you are about to learn are not just random phrases people use. These are subtle psychological signals that often reveal a deeper emotional avoidance pattern. Once you see them clearly, you will never hear them the same way again. You will start noticing the difference between real emotional availability and emotional distance disguised as normal communication. Stay until the end, because what you discover here might completely change the way you understand relationships, attachment, and emotional consistency. And more importantly, it may help you protect your peace in a way you have never done before. Now that you understand what is coming, it is important to understand why this topic actually changes the way you see relationships and even the way you see yourself. Because at first glance, emotional distance from someone does not look like a serious problem. It looks small, it looks temporary, it looks like something that will fix itself with time, patience, or better understanding. But in reality, this kind of pattern slowly reshapes your inner world without you noticing. It does not break you suddenly, it changes you quietly. When a person gives mixed emotional signals, your mind enters a constant state of scanning. You begin to read between lines that were never meant to be read deeply. A simple reply becomes meaningful. A delayed response becomes a question mark. A short message becomes a signal to decode. Over time, your attention shifts from living your own life to analyzing someone else's behavior. This is where emotional investment becomes dangerous in a silent way, because you are not just connecting with a person anymore. You are engaging with unpredictability, and unpredictability is mentally exhausting. It keeps the brain active in a loop of anticipation and disappointment. You expect closeness, then experience distance, and then start hoping again. This cycle repeats itself until it feels normal, even though it slowly drains emotional energy. What makes this even more powerful is how the human brain reacts to inconsistent emotional reward. When affection or attention is not given consistently, but only sometimes, the mind becomes more attached, not less. This is because the brain starts chasing the next moment of warmth. It begins to value the maybe more than the always. Without realizing it, emotional stability starts feeling less exciting than emotional unpredictability. And this is how attachment forms in the wrong direction. People often mistake this attachment for deep love or strong connection. But in many cases, it is not love that is growing stronger. It is emotional dependency built on inconsistency. The mind starts to hold on tighter, not because it feels safe, but because it fears losing those rare moments of connection. And this fear slowly becomes the foundation of emotional involvement. Over time, this creates a subtle shift in self-perception. You begin to measure your worth through someone else's availability. When they are warm, you feel valuable. When they are distant, you feel uncertain about yourself. This emotional dependency can quietly weaken confidence. You stop trusting your own feelings. You start questioning your own reactions. You begin to think that maybe you are asking for too much, even when your needs are completely normal. One of the most difficult parts of this experience is that it rarely feels dramatic enough to justify walking away. There are no clear arguments. There is no obvious rejection. There are only patterns that feel almost fine, but never fully secure. And this in-between state is what keeps many people stuck for a long time, because the mind always prefers partial connection over complete loss, even when that partial connection causes emotional confusion. Another reason this topic matters so deeply is because it affects boundaries. When someone repeatedly shows emotional inconsistency, your boundaries begin to shift without you realizing it. What once felt unacceptable slowly becomes acceptable. What once felt confusing starts feeling normal. You adjust your expectations downward just to maintain some level of connection. And in that adjustment, your emotional standards quietly weaken. This is not about blaming anyone. It is about understanding patterns that exist in human behavior. Some individuals naturally struggle with closeness, responsibility, or emotional intensity. They may not even be fully aware of the impact they create, but regardless of intention, the effect on the other person can still be significant. Emotional confusion is still emotional confusion, even if it is unintentional. The deeper truth is that emotional well-being depends heavily on consistency. The nervous system feels safest when signals are clear and stable. When communication, attention, and care are predictable, the mind relaxes. But when everything becomes unpredictable, the nervous system stays alert. It starts preparing for loss even during moments of connection. This creates internal tension that is hard to notice at first, but becomes heavier with time. This is why awareness is so important, because once you recognize these patterns, you stop interpreting confusion as something you must fix. You stop chasing clarity from someone who consistently creates ambiguity. You begin to see that peace is not found in decoding mixed signals, but in choosing emotional environments where signals are clear. And this is the real reason this topic matters. Not because it teaches you about others, but because it teaches you about yourself. It shows you how easily the mind can adapt to emotional inconsistency. It shows you how patience can slowly turn into self-neglect when it is not guided by clarity. And it shows you that emotional peace is not something that appears on its own. It is something that must be protected with awareness. As this understanding grows, you begin to shift internally. You no longer chase intensity. You start valuing stability. You stop confusing emotional distance with mystery, and you start recognizing that real connection does not require constant decoding. This awareness prepares you for what comes next, because once you understand the impact, the next step is learning how these patterns actually sound in everyday life. Now the focus shifts from understanding the emotional pattern to recognizing how it quietly appears in real communication. Because most people do not show emotional distance in an obvious way. They do not announce it. They do not explain it. Instead, it shows up in ordinary sentences that sound harmless at first. These sentences are not dramatic. They are simple, casual, and often used in everyday life. But when they repeat in a certain emotional context, they carry a different meaning underneath the surface. The challenge is that these expressions are designed in a way that feels reasonable. They do not trigger alarm immediately. In fact, they often sound responsible or even respectful. That is why so many people overlook them. The mind tends to trust what sounds logical on the surface, even when the emotional pattern behind it tells a different story. One common expression is when someone repeatedly frames their absence in terms of external pressure. It may sound like they are overwhelmed with tasks, responsibilities, or obligations. On the surface, this appears understandable. Everyone has a busy life. Everyone has responsibilities. But the key difference is repetition without adjustment. When this explanation becomes the default response every time emotional closeness is expected, it starts to form a pattern of distance rather than a temporary situation. What matters here is not the statement itself, but the consistency between words and behavior. In emotionally available connections, busyness does not erase connection. Even during hectic periods, there is still effort to maintain presence in a meaningful way. But in avoidant patterns, busyness becomes a shield that reduces emotional engagement without directly refusing it. Another subtle expression often used is a disclaimer about communication style. It is framed as a personal limitation, something like difficulty in staying responsive or maintaining regular contact. At first, this sounds like self-awareness. It sounds honest, but over time, it can function as a permission slip for emotional inconsistency. It lowers expectations while keeping the connection active. The impact of this is not immediate. It builds slowly. Because when someone openly states a limitation, the mind tries to be understanding. It adjusts expectations. It becomes more patient. It tolerates delays, gaps, and inconsistency, but gradually, what was once occasional becomes normal, and emotional reliability becomes harder to define. There is also a pattern where space is introduced as a frequent requirement. Space itself is not unhealthy. Every individual needs personal time, but the emotional effect changes when space becomes unpredictable and emotionally charged. Instead of being a healthy pause, it becomes a recurring withdrawal that interrupts connection before it can deepen. What makes this especially confusing is that after each period of distance, communication may return in a calm or familiar way. This creates a sense of reset. The connection feels restored temporarily, but the underlying cycle remains unchanged. Distance, return, distance again. Over time, this rhythm conditions the other person to wait rather than build stability. Another expression that often appears involves invalidating emotional interpretation. It happens when feelings are redirected or dismissed instead of being acknowledged. This creates self-doubt in the other person. Instead of trusting emotional perception, they begin to question whether their reactions are accurate. This shift is subtle but powerful. It changes how someone evaluates their own inner signals. There is also a very important phrase that appears during moments when expectations for clarity increase. It often signals resistance to deeper emotional commitment. At first, it may sound like honesty about readiness, but when it appears after emotional closeness has already formed, it introduces uncertainty into what was previously stable. It places the connection in a temporary state, even when emotions have already developed. The psychological effect of all these patterns combined is not just confusion. It is emotional imbalance. One side becomes more invested while the other maintains distance. One side seeks clarity while the other avoids definition. This mismatch creates a continuous loop where effort is not matched equally, yet the connection still continues. What makes this cycle difficult to exit is that it rarely reaches a breaking point. Instead of ending clearly, it stretches. It continues in reduced intensity. It becomes a version of connection that exists, but without depth or consistency. And because it still exists, it is harder to recognize as something unhealthy. Over time, the mind starts adapting to this reduced version of emotional connection. Expectations lower without conscious decision. Emotional needs are minimized internally. Patience increases beyond comfort, and slowly, what should feel secure starts feeling uncertain but familiar. This familiarity is the strongest trap. because the brain prefers known emotional patterns, even if they are unstable, over unfamiliar ones that are stable. So even when inconsistency creates discomfort, it can still feel harder to leave than to stay. This is where emotional conditioning becomes deeply embedded. Understanding these subtle expressions is not about becoming suspicious of every word someone says. It is about recognizing repetition, emotional impact, and behavioral consistency. It is about noticing when communication does not align with emotional security over time. Because once you can see these patterns clearly, you stop reacting only to words. You start observing the structure behind them. And when that shift happens, your emotional awareness becomes stronger than emotional confusion. Now the attention moves deeper, beyond surface communication, into what these patterns actually create inside a person over time. Because the real impact of emotional inconsistency is not always visible in the beginning. At first, it feels like patience. It feels like understanding. It feels like giving someone time to figure themselves out. But slowly, without notice, that patience begins to take emotional space that was once used for peace, confidence, and clarity. When a person stays in a situation where connection feels uncertain, the mind begins to operate differently. It stops relaxing in relationships and starts monitoring them. Instead of experiencing emotional safety, it begins scanning for changes. This shift is subtle, but it changes the entire internal experience of attachment. Over time, emotional energy becomes tied to signals rather than stability. A small message can lift mood significantly. A delay can create tension. A change in tone can shift emotional state. This creates a dependency on external cues rather than internal balance. The emotional system becomes reactive instead of steady. One of the strongest effects of this pattern is how it influences self-perception. When emotional closeness is inconsistent, the mind naturally searches for reasons. And because it is easier to look inward than outward, many people start turning the explanation toward themselves. They begin to believe they are the reason for the distance, not because it is true, but because the brain prefers a cause it can control. This internal questioning slowly weakens confidence. A person may begin to adjust behavior excessively, trying to become more acceptable, more careful, more emotionally measured. Instead of being natural, interaction becomes calculated. Instead of expressing freely, communication becomes filtered. This shift is often unnoticed, but it changes personality expression over time. Another important effect is emotional contraction. This is when a person starts holding back feelings to avoid disappointment. Instead of expressing needs, they minimize them. Instead of expecting clarity, they reduce expectations. Instead of seeking reassurance, they suppress the desire for it. This creates a quieter emotional presence, but not a healthier one. In this state, attachment does not disappear. It simply becomes internalized. The connection is still felt, but not fully expressed. And because it is not expressed, it does not receive resolution. This leads to lingering emotional tension that stays in the background of daily life. As this continues, emotional standards begin to shift. What once felt necessary for comfort starts feeling like too much to ask. Consistency becomes a luxury instead of a basic expectation. Clear communication becomes rare enough that its absence is no longer questioned. This gradual lowering of standards is one of the most significant long-term effects. At the same time, the mind develops adaptation strategies. It learns to focus on good moments while ignoring patterns of absence. It holds on to brief periods of warmth and overlooks longer periods of distance. This selective focus helps reduce emotional discomfort in the short term, but it reinforces instability in the long term. There is also a growing sensitivity to uncertainty. When emotional patterns are not stable, the nervous system becomes more alert. This means even small changes in communication style can feel significant. The mind becomes trained to expect shifts, which keeps it in a state of quiet tension even during calm moments. This ongoing tension affects emotional energy levels. Activities that once felt enjoyable may start feeling less engaging. Focus may become scattered due to constant background thinking. Even moments of rest may not feel fully restful because part of attention remains emotionally active. One of the most overlooked outcomes of this experience is how it reshapes expectations of relationships in general. After spending time in emotionally unpredictable dynamics, stability can begin to feel unfamiliar. Calm connection may even feel less stimulating at first, not because it is lacking, but because the nervous system has adapted to intensity and fluctuation. This is where clarity becomes essential, because without awareness, a person can normalize emotional imbalance and mistake it for depth or complexity. But emotional depth does not require confusion. It does not require constant uncertainty. It does not require inner conflict to exist. Real emotional security is often quiet. It does not require decoding. It does not require emotional guessing. It does not require waiting for meaning to appear. Instead, it feels steady, direct, and consistent over time. Understanding this difference helps break the cycle of internal adjustment. It allows a person to recognize when they are overextending emotionally to maintain something that is not naturally stable. And it creates space to evaluate connections based on patterns rather than moments, because the truth is emotional well-being is not built through intensity. It is built through reliability. And when reliability is missing, the mind may try to compensate by increasing patience, tolerance, or understanding. But those adjustments often come at the cost of inner peace. As awareness grows, something important begins to change internally. The focus slowly shifts from trying to maintain uncertain connections to observing how those connections actually feel over time. And that shift marks the beginning of emotional realignment, where clarity becomes more valuable than confusion.